Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time, we're going to be looking at something that's been making a lot of headlines. Walmart's decision to kind of scale back on some of its diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And, you might be thinking like, okay, big company makes a change, so what's the big deal? But I think the interesting thing here is this is actually part of a much bigger trend that we're seeing all across corporate America. We're seeing companies like Ford, Lowe's, Tractor Supply, even Harley-Davidson, all sort of reevaluating and in some cases scaling back their own DEI initiatives. So we're going to dive into that a little bit today, try to understand, what's driving this shift, what it looks like in practice, and what it all might mean.
Yeah, I think it's such a fascinating shift. And it really, I think, gets to the heart of, how companies are responding to the current cultural and political landscape that we're all navigating.
Yeah, it feels very much like a sort of a reaction to the moment that we're in right now. So maybe let's start with the specifics. When we talk about Walmart scaling back its DEI policies, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, they've made a series of pretty substantial policy changes. For example, they've shut down their Center for Racial Equity, which had been established relatively recently. And they've actually pulled out of the Human Rights Campaign's Inclusivity Index. That's the one that a lot of companies use as a kind of benchmark for, LGBTQ plus workplace equality. They're also ending the practice of prioritizing suppliers based on race or gender. And they're also going to be keeping a much closer eye on their third-party marketplace, the platform where other sellers can list items, to prevent the sale of certain products that are aimed at minors.
Okay, so those are some pretty concrete changes, and it sounds like they are really, kind of shifting gears in a pretty significant way. But the big question, I think, for a lot of people is why? Why is this happening now, and why are we seeing so many other companies kind of follow suit?
Well, there's definitely a growing conservative backlash against these kinds of corporate DEI programs. We're seeing activists like Ravi Starbuck, publicly celebrating Walmart's decision as a win in their campaign to, as they put it, end wokeness in corporate America. And, this backlash, which is being fueled in part by, these prominent figures in media outlets, is really putting a lot of pressure on companies.
Yeah, it feels like we're in this really particular political moment where these issues are especially heated and contested. And it also seems like, the Supreme Court's decision earlier this year to end affirmative action in college admissions is playing a role here, too.
Absolutely. I mean, the legal and political landscape has really shifted in recent months. And that's definitely creating a more challenging environment for companies to implement and sustain DEI programs. The Supreme Court ruling has emboldened legal challenges to these programs. And the current political climate, with figures like former President Trump, still wielding a lot of influence, is only adding fuel to the fire.
Right, so you've got this kind of pressure cooker of external factors. But what about Walmart themselves? What is their stated reasoning for making these changes? Because they're not really framing this as, a step back from diversity and inclusion, are they?
No, not at all. In fact, they're really emphasizing, the need to create a more inclusive environment for, as they put it, every customer and every associate. Their argument is that moving towards this broader sense of belonging is a more effective way to achieve that goal. It's an interesting framing because it kind of speaks to a much wider audience, and it seems less focused on, specific identity groups.
It's interesting, though, because I'm having a little bit of trouble reconciling this idea of belonging with some of the very specific policy changes that they're making, like discontinuing that Center for Racial Equity. I'm wondering, could this be a way for them to kind of navigate the legal complexities of those more targeted DEI initiatives while still, appealing to a broad base of customers and maybe mitigating some of that political risk?
That's such a great point. And I think it raises a really important question. What does this shift from DEI to belonging actually mean in practice?
Yeah.
Will it actually lead to a more inclusive workplace for everyone? Or is it more about optics and risk mitigation in the current climate?
Right. And how will this land with Walmart employees? Because we've already seen reports, even before these policy changes were announced, that there's pretty low morale and, quite a bit of job dissatisfaction among Walmart's workforce.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a real risk that these shifts could further impact employee morale, especially among those, from marginalized groups who might feel like their needs and perspectives are being kind of sidelined in this move towards a more generalized sense of belonging. It's definitely a complex situation. And I think it's really important to consider, how these changes will be perceived and experienced on the ground by the people who are most affected by them.
Yeah. So we've talked about the changes themselves, the context surrounding them, and some of the potential implications. But, you said earlier, this isn't just a Walmart story. We're seeing this trend play out with so many other companies. So I guess the question is, what does that tell us about the state of corporate America right now?
Well, I think it's just a much broader shift in how corporations are approaching diversity and inclusion. We're seeing a move away from the more, robust, targeted DEI initiatives that were gaining traction in recent years. And there just seems to be a growing hesitancy to really engage with these issues in a way that might be perceived as, too political or too controversial.
So is this just a temporary reaction to the current pressures, or is it a sign of like a more fundamental change in corporate value?
That's a great question, and it's one that I think we need to delve into further.
Yeah.
Because to really understand what's going on here, I think we need to look beyond just the headlines and analyze, the broader forces at play. So we'll be right back after a short break. And we'll continue our deep dive into this really fascinating and complex issue. It's interesting to think about this whole thing through the lens of, risk and reward. These big companies like Walmart, they have to make decisions that are going to satisfy a whole bunch of different stakeholders. Employees, customers, shareholders, even political figures.
Yeah, it's a lot to juggle. And it feels like in this particular climate that we're in right now, taking a strong stance on DEI could actually be perceived as more risky than maybe it was a few years ago.
Exactly. There's a potential for backlash from, certain customer segments.
Yeah.
There's the possibility of legal challenges. And then you've got the risk of negative attention from, influential figures.
Yeah.
So it's understandable that some companies might be choosing to kind of, err on the side of caution.
But is that caution coming at the expense of genuine progress? Like, is this shift to belonging actually going to move the needle on, diversity and inclusion? Or is it just a way to avoid tackling those harder, more systemic issues?
That is the million-dollar question. And I don't think there's an easy answer. Part of the challenge is that belonging is just such a much broader, more amorphous concept than, DEI. It can be interpreted in so many different ways.
So it becomes harder to measure, harder to hold companies accountable for specific outcomes.
Exactly. And that lack of clarity, I think, can create a sort of loophole where companies can, make these very sweeping statements about fostering a sense of belonging without necessarily having to demonstrate, concrete actions or results. It's almost like a PR strategy. It allows them to appear inclusive without actually making any real structural changes.
Which kind of brings us back to that potential disconnect between corporate rhetoric and the actual experiences of employees. We can't forget about the human impact of these policy changes.
Oh, absolutely. One former Walmart employee that I spoke to, they described the company's previous DEI efforts as, life-changing. They said that it made them feel seen and valued for the first time in their career. And now, with these programs being rolled back, they just feel this sense of disillusionment and worry that all that progress that they saw is being erased.
That's heartbreaking. It's a good reminder that these aren't just like abstract debates happening in boardrooms. They have very real consequences for people's lives, their sense of self-worth, their opportunities.
Right. And it highlights, I think, this fundamental tension that's at play here. On the one hand, you have these companies that are under pressure to navigate, these increasingly complex and polarized cultural and political landscapes. But on the other hand, they have this responsibility to create workplaces that are fair and equitable and inclusive for all of their employees.
It's like they're trying to find this middle ground, but in the process, they might be losing sight of those core values that underpin, DEI work in the first place.
Yeah, that's a very valid concern. And it raises another really important question. Are we witnessing, a true evolution in how corporations approach these issues? Or are we seeing a step backwards? Are companies genuinely trying to find new and better ways to foster inclusion? Or are they simply retreating from the complexities and challenges of, real DEI work?
It's a question I think that each company, each leader is going to have to grapple with.
Absolutely. And it's a question that we as a society need to keep asking. Because ultimately, the future of diversity and inclusion isn't just about corporate policies. It's about our collective commitment to creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to make sure that this progress doesn't stall or backslide?
Well, I think it starts with awareness, by understanding the forces at play, the different perspectives involved, and the potential consequences of these policy shifts. We can start to have, more informed and nuanced conversations about these issues.
So knowledge is power. The more we understand about these issues, the better equipped we are to advocate for change, to hold companies accountable, and to create a more inclusive future.
Exactly. And it's not just about what companies do. It's about what we do as individuals, as communities.
Mhm.
We need to continue to challenge discrimination, to educate ourselves and others,
Mm.
and to create spaces where everyone feels like they belong.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're at a crossroads. You've
Yeah.
got this push for broader inclusion, this emphasis on belonging, but at the same time, you have this real concern that this shift might actually come at the expense of those more targeted efforts
Yeah.
that are really needed to address, systemic inequalities.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And, I think it's important to acknowledge that the conversation around DEI is evolving. What might have been considered best practice, just a few years ago is being reevaluated in light of these new pressures and these legal challenges.
So how do we navigate this changing landscape? Like, how do we make sure that progress continues even as the conversation is kind of shifting underneath us?
Well, I think it requires a multifaceted approach.
Hmm.
For companies, I think it's about going beyond just changing their language and really demonstrating, a genuine commitment to creating inclusive workplaces. That means, taking concrete actions, measuring outcomes, and being transparent about their efforts.
And what about for individuals? What can we do on a personal level to really push for progress?
Well, I think it starts with having these conversations, educating ourselves about the issues and challenging, our own biases. It also means supporting organizations that are actively working to advance diversity and inclusion and holding our leaders accountable, for creating policies that actually promote equity.
It sounds like there's a real collective responsibility here. It's not just on corporations or policymakers. It's really on all of us to create a more inclusive society.
Exactly. And I think, even amidst all these setbacks and these challenges, there's still reason to be hopeful. There's a growing awareness of these issues, and more people are demanding change. The conversation is far from over. And I think that's a good thing.
That's right. So thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more inclusive world.